In this video, I'm going to take a critical look at the psychiatrist Dr. Bessel van der Kolk and his claims. I'm going to expose why and how he is a fraud. This is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. So, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is arguably the most famous and influential psychiatrist alive today. His book, The Body Keeps the Score, has sold over 3 million copies around the world and has topped the New York Times bestseller list for years. And his ideas around trauma and recovered memories, invisible trauma, this idea that the body keeps the score, that the body remembers trauma that the mind forgets and influences our behavior, has really taken a strong hold in our culture. I've noticed, so I've spent the last 27 years in private practice, and I've noticed in the last few years that this idea that the body keeps the score, that, it doesn't matter if your marriage is not working, or if you're drinking too much, or you're depressed or anxious, or if you have chronic pain, very likely there's some trauma that's at the root of this. Clients are quoting Bessel van der Kolk and how the body keeps the score. And these ideas have so infiltrated our culture. Now, the problem with this is that his ideas around recovered memory and that the body keeps the score really has no scientific foundation whatsoever. And the guy is a straight out fraud. So that's what I'm going to be going into in this particular video. Now, back in the 1980s and 90s, especially in the United States, there was a repressed memory epidemic. Richard Mcnally calls it the greatest catastrophe to strike mental health since lobotomy. The science writer Mark Pendergrast wrote in his book, The Repressed Memory Epidemic, that around the heyday, the early 90s, around 1 million people a year likely in therapy discovered memories of sexual abuse that they had no recollection of prior to the therapy. Bessel van der Kolk was one of the main advocates for this theory. This theory that if you experience something that's very traumatic, that the mind defends itself by blocking the memory, storing it in the unconscious or the body, where it essentially influences our thoughts and our behaviors and our feelings, and that it can be recalled later through psychotherapy. According to Mark Pendergrast, Bessel van der Kolk's testimony in court, he was very active in court cases where recovered memory was used as evidence. His testimony was crucial in getting quite a few innocent people convicted. So in the 80s and 90s, so many families were torn apart, so many people were unjustly accused of sexual abuse, and many people were sent to jail despite being innocent. Many of these cases were later overturned, but not all of them. So let's take a look at Bessel van der Kolk and his contributions to this mess, and how these ideas are making a comeback today and having such a strong negative impact on our culture. So let's go to 1996 to Boston. There's a particular case, Chassaid versus Gregory. So you had a 68-year-old woman called Anne Chassaid who was a patient of Bessel van der Kolk. Bessel van der Kolk had diagnosed her with PTSD. She was having issues in relationships. She was not sleeping well. She had intrusive thoughts. And she had recovered, with the help of Bessel van der Kolk, these repressed memories of her cousin Gregory, George Gregory, touching her in sexually inappropriate ways from the age of 12 till 17. Her cousin was 5 years older. Now, these memories allegedly came forth in therapy. Now, the thing is that she had a good relationship to her cousin all her entire life, in the 50 years or 40 years since this had been an issue. And her cousin had lended her quite a bit of money over the years. And right before these recovered memories had allegedly occurred, he had declined to lend her an additional $30,000. Now, Bessel van der Kolk diagnosed her with PTSD, and the PTSD was based upon, it was caused, according to Bessel van der Kolk, from these, repressed memories. So he told Judge Edward Harrington that repression was a scientific fact. So I'm giving you a quote here from the Boston Globe from April 10th, 1996. Yesterday, the expert witness, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, testified that the phenomena of repressed memories among trauma victims, especially those suffering from sexual abuse in childhood, is widely accepted by scientists and doctors. And he relied on a study by Judith Sherman and Emily Shatsov on incest victims who recovered lost memories in group therapy. He swore to the judge that Herman and Shatsov had provided the world with unshakable proof that repression of childhood sexual abuse is common. This is a lie. This is Bessel van der Kolk lying. So in 1996, there was no evidence, scientific evidence, proving repression or any mechanism that made repression possible. Now in 2024, as I make this video, there's still no controlled studies. There's still nothing in memory science that proves that repression is real. So it was not the case then, and it's not the case now. So to be specific here, when I talk about repression, I mean this idea that if something's really traumatic, then your mind will block it from awareness, store it in the body, in the muscle tissues, or in the unconscious mind, and that the memory is there like an old VHS tape recorder, which also Bessel van der Kolk used to claim, influences thoughts and feelings and can be recalled or retrieved using hypnosis or other therapeutic techniques later. There's no evidence for this whatsoever. Not only that, but later that year, so the year prior, there was a so-called Hungerford case, the Monahan Hungerford case, where skeptics of recovered memory were able to get a win in the New Hampshire courts, where they were able to get it so that anyone who was being charged of sexual abuse, where recovered memory was, the evidence, had a right to a hearing to assess the validity of that. And at the opposite side was Bessel van der Kolk, a guy called John Conte, and a guy called Daniel Brown, who all claimed that repression was a scientific fact. There's been so many tragedies, especially in the American court system, where people have been sent to prison due to only recovered memories. The most famous case, perhaps, is the George Franklin case. Very briefly, in 1989, his daughter, during therapy, started having recollections of her father, George Franklin, being the murderer of a young girl who was one of her friends, who was killed 20 years earlier. No one had ever been caught for that particular murder. There was no other evidence against her father, but he was, and Dr. Leonard Tur was the expert witness for the prosecution, and Elizabeth Loftus was the expert witness for the defense. And Leonard Tur was able to persuade the courts that to take seriously this repressed memory that had emerged in therapy, and George Franklin was sentenced to life in prison. He sat for 6 years because after a while, his daughter Eileen Franklin started to have memories in therapy also of him committing other murders, which the police discovered that he could not have done. So he was released in 1996. But there's a lot of tragic cases, especially when it comes to sexual abuse of this, especially in American courts. So that very so this, and what he also claimed in 1996 to Judge Harrington was that there's no scientific proof that victims of trauma, could fool psychiatric tests. That these recollected memories, if they were somehow false, could fool psychiatric tests. This is another lie that Bessel van der Kolk served. There's a lot of cases where people in therapy have gone to courts based upon these repressed memories, and where it's later been discovered that this was not the case at all. And also, he claimed that he was able to determine whether someone was speaking. So there's no test, of course, that can differentiate between a so-called false memory and a so-called recovered memory. So when Bessel van der Kolk says that there's no scientific evidence that victims can fool psychiatric tests, he fails to mention that there are no psychiatric tests. There is no test, there is no brain scan that can differentiate between the two. And when he was asked, how do you know the difference between, let's say, a real memory that's recovered and a false memory, he would say, well, it all comes down to internal consistency. If someone tells a detailed story that's internally coherent and consistent with proper effects, then he tends to believe them. This is quite horrible statement to make, especially regarding what we know from lie detection research, where we know that internal coherence and how believable someone comes across says nothing about whether they're actually honest or not. The lie detection research is extremely clear on this. So later on in 1996, this was December 28th, there was a lawyer / psychologist by the name of Christopher Barden, who, by the way, was very instrumental in helping shut down the recovered memory therapy and the multiple personality disorder therapy industry in the late 90s through very successful multi-million-dollar lawsuits against therapists who had done malpractice, who had helped install false memories, and who had helped send innocent people to prison. So he did a deposition of Bessel van der Kolk on December 28, 1996. So I'm quoting him here. Major research assistant Dania Vardy pled guilty to fabricating research, and that van der Kolk testified in a deceptive matter is a matter of public record. Furthermore, and this quoting Barden here, van der Kolk fled from the process server and dropped out of multiple cases rather than turn over his client data. And this was a deposition where Barden got him to admit to using faulty and missing data in some of his studies. There's a... under this video, I'm going to link this particular deposition. You know, it's called Bessel van der Kolk's Scientific Dishonesty and the Mysterious Disappearing Co-Author. Of course, that co-author was the very one who was caught and convicted for fabricating data. A lot of the data that Bessel van der Kolk used in these court cases. By the way, he made a comeback in the courts. In the early 2000s, his testimony was crucial in convicting the so-called street priest Paul Stanley. And in the case of Paul Stanley, he was a Catholic priest, the only evidence against him was the recovered memories of a person called Paul Busa, and he was sentenced to prison. And in 2007, more than 100 psychologists, psychiatrists, and memory researchers, wrote to courts and saying that, look, there's no scientific basis whatsoever for recovered memory. So that alone should not be the basis for a conviction. But the courts upheld the conviction. And Bessel van der Kolk writes about this. He has 2 chapters about this in his book, The Body Keeps the Score. Let's see here. I'm quoting Barden here again. Van der Kolk's testimony was crucial to putting innocent people in prison. During this period, this is the early 2000s, the Catholic priest scandals, I examined more than 50 people like Paul Busa, or Julian, as he's called in Bessel van der Kolk's book, remembered being abused by priests. This is exclusively through recovered memory, right? Remember that this was very lucrative too. These claims were denied about half the cases. That meant that it's likely that some 24 falsely accused priests were found guilty. So, final thing here, and this is from Mistakes Were Made, an excellent psychology book by Carol Travis and Elliot Aronson. There's a little bit of the deposition here that Christopher Barden did with Bessel van der Kolk. And this mostly shows Bessel van der Kolk's gross incompetency, of his claims. So question, are you aware of any research on the reliability or the validity of clinical judgment or clinical predictions based on interview information? Answer, no. What's your understanding of the current term disconfirming evidence? I guess that means evidence that disconfirms treasured notions that people have. Question, what's the most powerful piece of disconfirming evidence that you're aware of for the theory that people can repress memories or that they can block out of awareness a series of traumatic events, store those in their memory, and recover those with some accuracy years later? What's the strongest thing against that? Answer, I really can't think of any good evidence against that. Question, have you read any literature on the concept of false memories using hypnosis? Answer, no. Is there any research on whether clinicians over a period of years develop more accurate clinical judgment? Answer, I don't know if there is, actually. Is there a technique that you can use to distinguish true and false memories? Listen to this. This is awesome. We all, as human beings, are continuously faced with whether we believe what somebody feeds us or not. And we all make judgments all the time. And there is such a thing as internal consistency. And if people tell you something with internal consistency and with appropriate affect, you tend to believe that the stories are true. So let's start with that one because that's pretty catastrophic. So even at the time in 1996, there had been decades worth of research done on lie detection. And that lie detection research is very clear in that we human beings are basically very poor at determining when people lie. And it also shows very clearly that trying to assess whether someone's lying or telling the truth based upon body language and verbal utterances is extremely difficult. There really are no reliable cues. What the research also shows very clearly is that how believable someone comes across has virtually nothing to do with how honest they are. I'll say that again. How believable someone comes across has virtually nothing to do with how honest they actually are. So in Timothy Levine's book, Duped, which I highly recommend as an overview of lie detection research, he does a very interesting experiment with a bunch of seasoned police officers and interrogators where they get to watch people who are lying, essentially. And Peter Levine makes a distinction between people who are matched and people who are mismatched. So a person who's matched is a person who's, with his body language, his, as Bessel van der Kolk would say, appropriate affect and, consistency, and where the body movement seems consistent with the story. Someone who comes across matched and who happens to tell the truth. And someone who's mismatched would be someone, for example, who seems very honest but is actually lying. So when people were matched, the police officers and the interrogators were actually very good. But in the case of the sincere liar, the Bernie Madoffs of the world, the person who comes across as internally coherent and the proper affect, their rate was 14%. And in the case of people who came across as not believable due to fidgeting and averting their gaze and not answering questions directly, but were actually honest, their rates were 23%. And this should scare the crap out of everyone. Now, Levine's research obviously wasn't available at the time, but there was plenty of research to show this, and also to show that psychiatrists and psychologists and judges and police officers are not any better than regular folks in detecting deception. So this is quite incredible. So let's have a little look here at Bessel van der Kolk's evidence for repression, right? So he's done this study where 8 PTSD sufferers undergo PET scans while listening to narrative accounts, I'm quoting from his book here, of their traumas. Upon exiting the scanner, each subject describes that hearing the trauma script triggered a flashback. Extremely vivid reliving experience, complete with physical sensations and related to the trauma. Their brain scans reveal that during the flashbacks, Broca's area, one of the speech centers in the brain, often affected in stroke victims, went offline. Without a functioning Broca's area, you cannot put your thoughts and feelings into words. So the deactivation of Broca's area demonstrates that traumatic memory is inaccessible to narrative and declarative consciousness. Traumatic memory may be entirely organized on an implicit or perceptual level without an accompanying narrative of what happened. So, there are a bunch of problems with this. If someone say brushes their teeth versus relives being mugged, for example, their brain scans are likely going to look quite different, right? And that itself proves nothing. Now, as Richard Mcnally points out in his book Remembering Trauma, there's a couple of big flaws here. There's no control group. So you don't really know if you're measuring the effects of so-called traumatic memory. Here's another big thing, though. There really is no such thing as a traumatic memory or a traumatic event, because no event is inherently traumatic, right? Here's something else. We have no idea if, so here's something funny too. The narratives that were used to elicit this strong response came from the participants themselves. So they verbally offered the narrative that triggered this high activation that was supposed to make it so that their memory was not available to narrative consciousness, right? So that is kind of trying to have your cake and destroying your cake and eating it too. Also, there's no way of knowing, like, what would have happened if they had been read a fictitious narrative. Would they have responded the exact same way? And the truth is, there's no test to distinguish between, let's say, a false memory and an actual recovered memory. So, for example, here in Norway, where I live, last year, there was a cold case where 2 police officers and 1 medical doctor were shown to have false memories. This was a 27-year-old case, by the way. And one of the police officers was describing a very coherent, detailed story with a lot of affect of how traumatizing it was for him to be one of those who, put the body onto the gurney and into the car and all sorts of stuff. And then it was later revealed that he wasn't even there. He was at the police station, doing an interview at the time. So there's no test that could determine the difference between a false memory like that and an alleged recovered memory. Now, here's something else also to keep in mind. And this is a mistake because we talk about traumatic events, but remember that events are not inherently traumatic. It's what we think they mean. It's what we make out of them. So there were kind of 2 theories regarding so-called traumatic events of, let's say, sexual abuse. One theory was that, well, you get so activated with stress hormones and emotion that you tend to remember it better, not worse. And there's quite a bit to support this. You don't hear about Holocaust survivors who have repressed the Holocaust. They tend to remember it, all too well. The other theory that Bessel van der Kolk and his colleagues were presenting was this idea that because it's so traumatic, the mind protects itself by hiding it in the body, and like a VHS tape, and where it can later be recalled, during therapy. There's really no evidence of this one at all. But here's a third category that Bessel van der Kolk never opened for, and which there's quite a bit to support, and that is that there are quite a few people who, they're not brutally raped. Let's say that they're 8 years old and that their grandfather maybe fondles them or touches them in an inappropriate way, and they kind of like their grandfather, but it feels confusing, it feels kind of wrong. But then the grandfather is very nice to them afterwards and says, shh, this is our little secret and I love you. And they don't tell anyone. And let's say the grandfather dies and they kind of forget about it. They don't think about it. They kind of forget about it because it was confusing. It wasn't really a traumatic memory to begin with. And then 20 years later, they sit, in some sort of group perhaps, or they have a friend, or they read a book that tells them about something similar, and suddenly they remember it, right? But this isn't repression. This is just the natural act of remembering something, right? So let's look at the evidence that Bessel van der Kolk lied to the judge about having. So, well, here's the scientific evidence. And remember, with this study, he swore to the judge that Herman and Schatzow had provided, irrefutable proof that repression of childhood trauma existed. So I'm reading this from Horse of the Court by Margaret Hagan, which is an excellent book. Let's see here. One such study, which Dr. van der Kolk referred to as Herman and Schatzow study, looked at victims of sexual abuse and found that only approximately 1/3 of the victims remembered all the details of the abuse. Another 1/3 of the victims had a partial memory of the abuse, while the final 1/3 of the victims remembered nothing relating to the abuse. Dr. van der Kolk stated that these figures represent the sort of figures that every study comes in with, regardless of what the methodology is. Now, for the real women who were part of the incest survivors therapy group run by these two therapists, 26% of the patients had no memories of sexual abuse at all. Yet the therapists write that the women who can't remember being abused at all suffered the abuse at a younger average age, 4.9 years versus 10.6 years, than the ones who did remember. How can they possibly know the age when the abuse supposedly occurred if the women don't remember anything about the abuse at all? What are these women doing in an incest survivor group in the first place if they can't remember any incest? But after a while they can. Quoting again here from the study, participation in group proved to be a powerful stimuli for recovery of memory in patients with severe amnesia. During group therapy, more than 1/4 of the women experienced eruption into consciousness of memories that had been entirely repressed. So, is this proof of repression? It's proof of nothing at all. It's proof that some women didn't remember anything, or said they didn't remember anything at the beginning of the program, and then had memories later. Now, there are several possible explanations for this. One is false memory. We have a lot of evidence that people can, in therapy, due to suggestion and expectancy and being influenced by a group, if they've been told that their symptoms are likely the result of repressed sexual abuse and that they need to remember the abuse to get well, people often can develop false memories. So that's a possibility. Another possibility is that they just didn't tell about these memories to begin with. And a third one is that they had just simply forgotten about them. A lot of this was based upon, fondling and relatively mild stuff. And some of the people, too, were very young. So it could just as easily be a case of just forgetting things and then remembering them later. None of this proves the idea of repression. Now, and then he had another study that he quoted, which he called the best ever. This is the Linda Harrington study. This is the best ever study according to Bessel van der Kolk. And and this was based upon a hospital where people came in for suspicions of sexual abuse, where she interviewed people. And then 17 years later, she tracked down the ones she could find of these people. And 38% no longer remembered the abuse 17 years later. So does that mean that she discovered that 38% had amnesia? Well, let's look at this. So the youngest participant in this group was 10 months old. 10 months old. What do you expect her to remember? You know, people don't develop autobiographical memories until they're maybe 2.5 or 3 or 4 years old. You know, something around that. So you had a number of very young kids. There was no physical trauma in 34% of cases. In 38% of them, there was no physical force. You know, and these were inner city families who used the emergency department of the hospital as their doctor, essentially, right? So given that a lot of this was fondling and kind of mild stuff, there's a good chance that they just forgot about it. Or maybe some of them didn't want to talk about it. These are all very, very possible. Something else too. I mean, given that this was that the emergency department was essentially their doctor, so to speak, there was no control in terms of, well, how many other incidents of visiting the ER had they forgotten during their childhood? And given that many of them reported multiple events of sexual abuse, but neglected to mention this one, you know, what about all the other things that they arrived in the ER for? Or even a control group of other kids who had not been sexually abused, who used the ER throughout their upbringing as inner city kids. How many of those visits did those kids forget? How many of those visits could those kids not remember 17 years later? None of this proves repression at all. I'll end with this. You know, in this idea that, you know, if memories were false, you could not have fooled the psychiatrists and their tests. Well, A, as I mentioned earlier, there are no tests. But B, in Scandinavia, between 1994 and the year 2000, a guy called Thomas Quick was convicted of 8 murders, 5 in Sweden, 3 in Norway. He was a psychiatric patient. He was very lonely. He was ignored. And to get attention and to get access to drugs, he started admitting these unsolved murders. And this was information he got from newspapers and from the outside. So he started admitting these unsolved murders, and the nurses got very interested in him, and they gave him drugs, you know, and the police got interested. And in Stockholm, Sweden, at this particular hospital called Säter, the head psychiatrist was a psychoanalyst who believed in multiple personalities and recovered memories called Margaret Norell. And she started doing regression work, calling out alters, and this English alter appeared, you know, who had done all these murders and all these. They were convinced that he had to have had all these repressed memories. They started digging for memories, and he complied by offering up very coherent, very affect-laden. I've watched videos of interviews and scenes where he, you know, recreates his murders, stuff like that. There's been made movies about this. And he gets convicted for... He confessed to over 30 murders, but he got convicted for 8. 5 in Sweden and 3 in Norway, right? He had absolutely nothing to do with any of them. His stories fooled the psychiatrists, the police officers, the judges, the media. He may have fooled himself too on some of these, or he may not. But there was no other evidence for these murders at all. And there was one journalist called Hannes Rostam, who unfortunately is dead, and his partner, who started working on this and looking into this, and were able to show the courts that he had nothing to do with any of it. And he retracted his confession, and he got exonerated for all 8 murders. So that's quite an interesting story if you want to look into it. Of course, Bessel van der Kolk should have been discredited forever, but with his book and his 150 trauma centers in the United States, he is arguably, as I said, the most famous and influential psychiatrist around today. And he's changed our culture to a so-called trauma-conscious culture, where people see trauma everywhere, and there's hardly any scientific evidence to support that childhood trauma or trauma is such an important factor. Not only that, but the whole PTSD industry that he is part of, PTSD is probably, in addition to dissociative identity disorder, the most poorly formulated diagnosis of the various big psychiatric diagnoses. Of course, as with all psychiatric diagnoses, there's no biomarker, there's no tests to confirm or disconfirm PTSD. All you really need to do to get a PTSD diagnosis is to claim to have intrusive thoughts based upon some trauma, and that you're grumpy and irritable and that you can't sleep. That's essentially it. And this idea that PTSD is a disorder of memory is also a position that has very little to actually support it. So there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical to the claims of Bessel van der Kolk. I see his influence everywhere, even in meditation circles. People talk about the body remembers and stored trauma and all sorts of stuff. Anyways, I hope this was thought-provoking. I hope you will investigate this and look into the topics. I highly recommend Mark Pendergast's books, The Repressed Memory Epidemic. If you want a somewhat easier read, go for Memory Warp. Try to Remember by Paul McHugh is an excellent book. Horse of the Courts by Margaret Hagan is excellent if you want to look into some of the cases there with Bessel van der Kolk. Know that I see clients from all over the world, not trauma-informed. There's no trauma care. There's no presumption of recovered memories. If you want to see if you and I could be a good fit in terms of working together, you're welcome to reach me at provocativehypnosis.com. If you have any comments or questions, please do post them below the video. As always, thanks for listening.